Hello, so welcome to our event tonight. My name is Tamara Walker. I am the policy coordinator for the NSAW New York State chapter. This evening, we will be going over some points about the New York State budget for 2001-2002. And we will begin. So I will allow for the other presenters to introduce themselves, and we will be going over some points of the budget, as I mentioned.
Hi, I'm Evelyn Williams, and I am the policy director.
Hi, I'm Sarah Jeroman, and I'm a policy intern.
So we decided as part of the series of 4 webinars that lead into Capital Action Day, which is in February, we are providing some information on various aspects of the legislative and gubernatorial process that will really determine will determine conversations that are going to become more intensified in January, leading up to the passage of the New York State budget for fiscal year 2023, as well as maybe having some impact on other pieces of legislation. Even though people may be primarily concerned with various types of legislation and they're about advocating for them, one of the things that's very important that oftentimes is missed is what they call the fiscal impact of legislation. So even though when you are proposing a piece of legislation, you personally may not be talking about what dollars are required for this to be implemented, but when a piece of legislation is passed, they have to think about, does it have any type of fiscal implication? Because for a piece of legislation to actually be enacted, if it has dollars attached to it, it's not going to be enacted even though it may be passed. So you have 2 types of legislation. You have one that has what they call fiscal impact, and you have legislation that's more administrative. So it has nothing to do with dollars. And generally those types of legislation often will not be strongly considered between January and March, but will be held in abeyance until April, May, up until June. That is because, given the amount of intensity that's going on beforehand, to then, set aside to do some administrative legislation. Sometimes they will, particularly if it's something that they need to do because it has an impact on something else that they also need to do. And I say they, meaning the legislators. So that being said, what I wanted to just provide as a general overview in a way is, first of all, to think about how the budget itself is prepared. And oftentimes people will hear that the governor is going to present the 2 addresses that the governor makes. The first is the state of the state, which is usually in the 2nd week of January. And then the governor will present the governor's proposed fiscal 2023 budget, usually either the 3rd or the last week in January. That presentation is made to the legislature. So, it is televised, you'll be able to see it, but what you will see is that she's talking to the legislator. And the reason why she's doing that is because she is giving them her budget. She's saying, here is my proposed budget for New York State. Now, the governor is the administrator of the state. So just like you have 3 divisions of government, the governor is the administrative arm of the New York State tripod. And so therefore, the governor is the one who puts the budget together. And then that budget is presented to the legislature. And then they, in turn, begin to work along with the governor on modifying or adding in, taking out, whatever, to come up with a budget that is finally passed by the legislature, that has to be passed by March 31st of 2022. So that being said, when does all of this start? Well, quietly, the state agencies are the key authors in the budget. You know, people don't know that because it's sort of quiet. They hear the governor, but each state agency has to put together their proposed budget for the next fiscal year. And that's the process. And that comes from the Division of Budget, which is the operating arm. The governor's office, could think of your state agencies as the governor's offices. Division of Budget is the one that oversees the New York State budget. They're the ones who package it, who puts the budget together, makes the forecasting, all of that, which is then given to the governor, you know, through the director of the budget. And they in turn will sit with, you know, the various staff of the governor's office. Once a draft budget is put together by DOB, they will sit with the governor and then talk through what their recommendations are for the next fiscal year. The governor's staff will also then be involved in that process. And usually as the state agencies are building up their budgets, the governor's office staff people, and you have, the governor has staff people for each agency. So they will be working in tandem with the Division of Budget and the state agencies around actually the budget line items for the entire budget. And then the governor's staff will also add in budget recommendations that they want to see in the governor's budget. So it's a relationship between the state agencies and the governor's office. That's how the whole process starts. When the governor then introduces the budget to the legislature, now the process of negotiation begins with the governor's office and the legislature. You will see next year, once the budget is actually presented, the legislature will hold hearings on various components of the budget. And the reason why they hold hearings is that sometimes they want to hear from the constituencies about whether or not some of these proposed budget items are going to be beneficial to the constituents. Will they be harmful? Is it enough, not enough, all those kinds of things. And so from January through March, what happens is that, and I understand through state law now, that both the Assembly and the Senate have to establish what's called a commission, whereby it is a bipartisan body of people from the legislature who actually analyzes the governor's budget. Excuse me. And then so from that, then the commission actually sends these recommendations back to both the Assembly and the Senate. At the same time, the committees within the Assembly and the Senate, they're also putting their budget wishes together, and they're submitting them to this commission. And then, excuse me a minute. And then after all that is done, it then goes to both the heads of the Assembly and the Senate. And when people feel that they have arrived at least what they think is somewhat of a compromise budget, the Assembly and the Senate will then vote on, you know, certain recommendations. Then that is given to both the Assembly Speaker Hesty, Majority Leader Stewart Cousins, and Hochul. Will all, the three of them, usually the last week in March, they will get together in closed doors and they will hammer out the various budget items. At this level, we're talking about the gross, the macro level of the budget. We're not talking about these the little lines that only cost $1 million or maybe even $50 million. We're talking, you know, millions, $100 million, $1 billion. This is the kind of conversations that they're having. And then they come up with an agreement, which then comes back to both the Assembly and the Senate. And the final agreed budget between the three of them then has to be voted on by the Assembly and the Senate. And once that vote is taken, then the budget is passed. So that's the process of the budget, but understanding that the process began back in June of this year, which is going to be also interesting because of the change in leadership right in the middle of the beginning of the budget process. And so that's going to be interesting to see how all of this works out for next year. And, people may not realize how much work Hochul and her, she's bringing in people. And these are people who probably, some of them don't have familiarity with the budget and some of the projections and all that. And so I just can imagine what they're going through right now, trying to really, get on board. I'm sure she has kept a lot of people who were working under Cuomo. I'm sure she has kept them. She has to, because they have too much history to then be able to have them go and have some new people coming in trying to figure out what's been happening for the last 5 years. Because one of the things about the budget is that even though we're talking about fiscal year 2023, we have to think of that in the context of the last 5 years, because the budget is not something that's static each year. It's something that is fluid, continuous, and it also is malleable based upon the various variables that are happening outside of the general electorate process, meaning the environment, people, what's happening, both at city level, county levels, what's happening in Congress, all these kinds of things are germane to then how the budget is going to look for the next year. And given the pandemic, and what was really interesting in reading some of these documents was the fact that they talked about that one of the things that they actually are trying to budget in, which they learned from 9/11. So they said they've had three crises, major ones. And one was 9/11. It was also the recession of 2008, and now the pandemic. And so part of this understanding that you can't predict these kinds of events that occur like that, but the impact, for instance, of the pandemic is believed they can be experiencing the impact of the pandemic all the way out to 2025 financially. So that's the kind of thing that they have to think about in terms of then how do we form a budget that whereby there's certain aspects of it that we cannot predict as yet, because the pandemic is a phenomenon that this state has never experienced before. And so therefore it can't even interpret yet what the real outcomes of this pandemic is going to be. And now that we're hearing some other variant is coming into the picture, it's just everything is somewhat speculative. So that being said, the budget itself the budget is over $200 billion, which is, a lot of zeros. And there are 5 components of the New York State budget. And so, and this is good to understand, because one of the things when you start advocating for legislation, sometimes when you advocate for a piece of legislation, a legislator might say to you, do you want these monies to come out of the general fund? Or are you talking about the state special? They will ask you that, where would you like to see these monies come out of? So that's the other thing. One has to understand the various components of the budget, because then you want to be able to intelligently talk about the fiscal impact and how you think that your proposed legislation is going to be a revenue, is going to be either revenue neutral, or that eventually it will be positive in one way or another. It might be either profits, or it could be in the sense of reducing certain types of disparities for which the state has to pay a lot of money on, to see people be well, to get well. And that as you improve, care, that money that's being assigned to, delivery of services can be referred somewhere else because of that. So there are different ways you can narrate that. So you have 5 components of the budget. The first one that maybe they've heard at least about is called the general fund. And that's what it is. It's a general fund. It's like the pot where, most of the money goes into. But you also have what's called the state special revenue fund. And so the difference between a general fund and a special fund is that a general fund, think about it such as your personal budget, where you just have a budget for your, for running your life. But then you may have, for instance, you may say, well, I want to go on vacation next year, and you price out that it's going to cost you maybe $2,000-$3,000 to do this trip that you want to do. So what do? You don't put the vacation in with your general budget. You will create a special budget for your vacation, and then you will move monies over into that vacation fund so that you can have the necessary money you need when you actually, are about to go on vacation. So that becomes a special fund. So for instance, the marijuana legislation that was passed last year, and that is going to be implemented going into 2022. Get my years right. 2022. With that is the marijuana legislation. There is a revenue aspect to the marijuana legislation, which means that the state is going to be getting money from the taxes and fees that people will be paying in order to be able to, grow marijuana and sell marijuana. Plus, people will be buying marijuana. And so therefore, that money that's coming from the marijuana legislation is going to go into a special fund. It is not going to go into the general fund, which will be distributed through all different cost centers. It's going into a special fund that will then be used for specific purposes. Usually what we call it is, we say allocated, but there's the targeted monies is targeted. So for instance, in the marijuana legislation, it said 30% of the revenues that come from marijuana legislation will need to go to communities who have been harmed by the war on drugs, which historically has had a negative impact on many communities. And so 30%. Now, let's just say some people are looking at what has happened in other states who have legalized marijuana. And they have indicated that in the first 6 months, they have accrued over $500 million just from marijuana revenue. So imagine 30% of $500,000 is $50,000. I mean, excuse me, $50,000 that'll be allocated. I'm wrong. Yeah, 50. No, that seems low. Excuse me. Was it 50? It might have been million. All right, I have to check my numbers. I think it's million. Anyway, because I was saying it was 50 million that would be assigned to these communities. And so that's targeted money. So it goes into what's called the state special revenue fund. Then the third fund is the federal special fund, because, and some of this is somewhat not as obvious, but the state, not only through Medicaid and Medicare, but the state does receive dollars from the feds for various types of projects. Just like the state has requests for proposals, and communities and organizations can apply for money, the federal government also has requests for proposals. And so therefore the state can apply to these various federal programs, and if they get awarded the grant, then they receive federal dollars. So there are federal dollars that are targeted, that are given to New York State under different conditions that then go into a special fund. And that means those dollars are also restricted in that they are then targeted to various types of activities. Now, what is somewhat unclear, but I think we'll hear more about it, is how the relief, the rescue plan and the rescue monies that have come in. some of those rescue dollars, over, what is it, $20 billion that came in just for education alone. I think that part is still, what could I say, a budgeting strategies per se, on how much of that may be able to go back into the general fund, and how much of it is going, some of it definitely is going straight to the counties. Some of it might be, and this is based upon how Congress wrote the legislation. In the legislation, they have definitely indicated how these dollars that are coming into New York State, how they are to be appropriated. And that might mean, and they might say, X percent can go into the general fund, or they may say some of these dollars are to be targeted to the deficits that the state has received due to the reduction in state revenue because of the shutdown, the lockdown. So then the state would have to say, okay, based upon our 4-year experience in the last 4 years in terms of businesses paying sales tax, people paying sales tax, by purchasing items, et cetera, that, we anticipate that we are losing up to 20 or 25% of our potential revenue. So then, Congress may say, well, then, you can dedicate 25% of this relief package to supplementing the loss that you will or have experienced related to the pandemic. So all of that then potentially can be in the federal special fund, it can go into the general fund, and sometimes it might be in the state. It all depends upon how all of that's negotiated and where the dollars are going to be assigned. The fourth area is called the federal capital projects. And what Cuomo did this year, which will be interesting to see what Hochul says going into next year, is he presented a $30 billion project, infrastructure capital investment project that is to go over for maybe 5-8 years. I don't remember the length, but it's, whereby we're talking about refurbishing various aspects of the infrastructure. There are issues related to, let's say, like the tunnels in New York City. There also are issues with many of the bridges, because some of them are old. They were built like in the 1930s, 1940s, and they're beginning to start to crumble in certain areas. Also, we have highway systems that need to be repaired, as well as there's definitely the MTA, Metropolitan Transportation Authority, which has suffered a severe financial impact because of the pandemic and the lockdown. So people weren't traveling, weren't using public transportation. And so therefore there's a need now to figure out how to not only address that deficit of the MTA, but also to look at such things as there still needs to be work on the rail systems, bus systems, that kind of thing. So that's a whole nother budget category. And then the last one is debt service. Now this is related, and perhaps you may be familiar in the past, if you in voting, sometimes when you go to vote, you will not only be choosing whom to be in, what position, but you will also be voting on bonds. Sometimes they'll have a bond issue, and they'll say, you're voting for the state to purchase bonds. Sometimes the state will purchase bonds for construction, or they'll purchase bonds for some type of other infrastructure project, or they'll purchase bonds for education, or these are different kinds of arenas where, or right now, there's some issues with some of your health facilities are in a severe deficit status, and so therefore sometimes the state will go into a loan arrangement. They will purchase bonds in order to bail out, let's say, hospitals who potentially could close down. So those bonds then, have a certain amount of life to them, 10 years, 15 years. But anyway, that's considered debt service, meaning that the state now has to pay back those bonds. And so therefore they have a separate account in the budget that speaks to where monies go to be able then to pay back this debt over a period of time. So those are the 5 areas of the budget, very quickly stated, for which the document that we've been working from is over 100-something pages long. Tamara, can you bring up the budget chart, please? Okay. All right, so this is a glance, as they say, at looking at both the past FY 2021 budget, which ended March 31st of this year, and then the FY 2022 budget, which started April 1 and will go to the end of March 31st in 2022. So you will see in the last right-hand column that as of now, they're showing you how much money has been allocated or for this mid-year point in time. And what you can see over this, if you look at the 113, which is in millions of dollars, which then is 113 billion, is that if you double that, then that's over the $200 billion budget that I talked about. Then so you see, here is your total line, and then they're showing you the growth, which is quite interesting that you see a growth of expenditures of like 0.4 over in a particular quarter from the first quarter to the second. And then if you look in the left-hand column and you follow down, you see what I was talking about here in terms of you have the general fund, and transfers, have to do with things such as when you have big budgets like this, one of the things that happens is that, if you find that, you have an unexpended balance in one category, let's just say like the capital budget, let's say you had anticipated you had budgeted a certain amount, but you're beginning to see that you need some of that money because, something in the general fund really you have to fund that, then, you will transfer monies into the general fund. So from an accounting perspective, when they say including transfers, they're letting the reader know that that number includes how money has been moved. If money has been moved, that money is now being recorded in another budget category, which here is general fund. The capital budget is the one related to what I was talking about in terms of monies assigned to dealing with the infrastructure issue. And then the federal operating aid, it shows you here from 70 billion, and right now it's at 81 billion, and that's going to be, we can at least say that the federal, monies will reach up to maybe 160 billion by the end of the fiscal year. and then, then you can look at all funds, moving down. And I will say the only thing, and I was saying to Tamara that I actually have to talk with someone on that budget line, because to me, if that's 210 billion for a half a year, then we'd be talking about 420 billion for the full year. So I think that means something else, and I'm going to need to ask somebody to clarify that budget line. Then when you pass inflation, you move into then the receipts. So here we're talking about revenue. They're not using it as such. They use a different language, and this gets into, and they do explain the type of accounting procedures they use. And they're also, which is sometimes hard for me because I'm not used to working with cash budgets, but the New York State actually uses their budgets. What this budget is on a cash basis, which sometimes throws things off some. But you see where you see the taxes, so it's showing you they're using receipts, which technically is is an appropriate word, because when money comes in, it's a receipt. You're receiving something. So that's how they're defining this. Other places they would use the word revenues. So you have taxes, then you have other types of revenues coming in, and then you see here with the federal that by the second half of this year, 97 billion of federal revenues have come in. And again, then you have revenues of 220 billion dollars. And then you go down to general cash, the general fund. And here, this is like, and I just want to talk a little, and I got to stop, a little bit about the rainy day reserves. This is going to be a political topic this coming year, because there's, a lot of money has come in, and you're going to have a narrative whereby there are going to be some people who are going to feel that the excess in revenue from previous years based upon the rescue plan revenues, that they ought to be spent. Okay, I mean, there are going to be people who feel this. However, based upon the report, it is felt that they say that this is the first time in New York State's history that New York State has the opportunity to really fund the rainy day reserves at a level that will actually be, what can we say, fiscally prudent for the future. And what I mean by that is it's felt that you don't spend down to the last dollar, because we just came through a pandemic. People have been impacted in a number of different ways because of that. So now you have, for instance, unemployment was expanded, and the amount was increased. That money has to come from somewhere, and it's not coming from Congress. This is a decision that was made by New York State. So the budget has to have what we call reserves, and these reserves are designed for unanticipated external events that have not been planned budgetarily, but the money has to be spent on these events when the occurrence occurs. So what they're trying to do, and Hochul, I know, is part of this part of the group who's saying this, is what they want to do now is that they want to, over the next 5 years, they want to take some of this unexpended money, and rather than spending it on programs and and projects, to take the money and begin to put it in to increase what's called the reserve pool, and with the intention that by 2025 the amount is, what is it? It'll be either 15% of the state budget, or some other people are saying that New York State should have 2 months of operating expenses in reserve. And so that's the game plan to get there by 2025. And they feel that given where we are now and the amount of infusion dollars that came in from Congress, that the state now has the opportunity to do this spread over 5 years. So that's what that rainy day reserves, along with economic uncertainties, extraordinary monetary settlements, all of those things. And if you think about now the pandemic, that whole category there, general fund cash, was about, needing money to do all these various things, trying to support some businesses to stay in business. Now they're going to be trying to support small businesses to be able to come back alive and get back to their level of earnings. There's a lot going on just trying to recover from the pandemic, and this kind of reserve will help them do that. And as I said before, debt service has to do with paying back paying the installment payments on loans that the state has with various funding entities. So I will stop there and let Sarah come in.
Yes, thank you.
You're
So
welcome.
I'll talk a little bit more about New York State's Medicaid budget. And so similar to kind of how Evelyn was touching on this surplus and influx of money, New York State's Medicaid is actually not in a surplus. We're actually planning on entering a deficit beginning in fiscal year 2023, where our spending will exceed the global cap. This is largely due to a decrease in EFMAP funding, which is federal medical assistance percentage. And during the pandemic, we got an increase of around 6% in federal funding to kind of offset the pandemic. So there was 1.1 million enrollees in Medicaid that came in during the pandemic because of unemployment and other pandemic related issues. So the federal government basically gave us more funds to offset those costs. However, that funding is set to run out in January 2022, and that funding will get us to around, they think, March 2022 and April 2022. And so that'll get us through this fiscal year, but then starting in 2023, we're about to projected deficits of around 137 million, and then increasing to 1.1 billion in fiscal year 2024, and then 1.3 billion in fiscal year 2025. And so what does this really mean? I mean, I think it's important to talk about what exceeding that global cap would actually mean for the state, because I know that I hear these big numbers, and sometimes I hear like the US is in $3 trillion worth of debt, and you're kind of like, okay, so what does that really mean for anyone? And so what it would mean for the state to exceed the global cap is that we would have to put in a Medicaid savings allocation plan. And what this usually looks like is cuts to reimbursement for providers and cuts to benefits for members. The person who makes this plan is usually the DOH commissioner, and there is a new DOH commissioner who was appointed by Governor Hochul. It's Mary T. Bassett, and she hasn't really done much yet because she was recently appointed, but this would be something she would have to put together, which would be particularly interesting because we haven't really seen any of her work yet. The majority of her work in the past has been on eliminating racial disparities in health, so it would be interesting to see how that could potentially play into this plan, if at all. But so what are the kind of plans to offset this deficit? So there has been recent talk about the Build Back Better Act, which is currently in Congress on a federal level. And a few people have been talking about that in terms of offsetting New York's deficits because there are a lot of healthcare implications of that. People are saying this could be the biggest changes in healthcare since Obamacare, and they have had to modify it recently to try and get it passed. But it would still, if passed, it would allow the federal government to lower prices on up to 20 drugs per year. It would allow Medicaid for new mothers up to a year, which right now it's only 60 days after delivery, and it would cover more children under Medicaid as well. So more middle income children and not just lower income. And so obviously these would incur costs at the state because it would be more coverage, but a lot of people think that federal funding would come into the state for these as well. So that could help to offset some of this deficit. And then prior to the pandemic, there was the Medicaid redesign team that was formed. This was formed by Governor Andrew Cuomo, and it's actually the second one of its kind. And it's basically there to redesign some of the Medicare programs in order to save, basically. And a lot of the programs would basically trying to make them more efficient. So putting money into them. So you're taking away from high cost emergency care and putting in more preventative care. And I'll touch on that a little bit more in a second. But so I also am talking about this deficit, but there is this money that did come in that will last us through 2022. So I want to kind of talk about what that's actually going to be used for and how it could impact social workers. And so the Behavioral Health Network actually did an interview with the heads of the Office of Mental Health, Office of Alcoholism and Substance Abuse Services, and the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities to kind of just talk to them about how they're using funding. And so they're saying, hey, we gave you all this money, like what do you plan to do with it? And so a large majority of these funds, they basically have said that they are putting into the workforce, which is of particular interest to us because social workers are going to be benefiting from this money if they do follow the plans that they've laid out. And so OMH in particular has said that they're planning on rolling out initiatives for recruitment and retention with specific emphasis on those who are multilingual providers or diverse providers in order to expand their ability to be culturally competent and serve historically underserved communities. And they want to make sure that their providers who are also part of these communities are feeling supported because they do tend to have higher rates of burnout. They are also going to be putting in training on wellness and mindfulness with this FMAP funding, as well as increasing salaries and to kind of compensate providers who have been a little overworked during this time. Similarly, OASIS is using the FMAP funds to provide services for their workers. They are targeting 3 key areas. One is tuition support for workers who are going back to school, loan forgiveness for employees who already have loans, and then training for staff similar to OMH, targeting wellness and stuff that would prevent burnout. And then OPWDD is doing the same thing. And they actually, it was funny that you brought the American Rescue Plan, Evelyn, but they cited that they received a lot of funds from the American Rescue Plan that they're putting towards workforce initiatives and particularly salary increases. And they actually said they named a number. So 76% of that funding is going to workforce initiatives, which is around $554 million. And then they will include 514 of that to increase wages and salaries of direct support professionals and supervisors, which is really good for social workers who work in these agencies, and something to really keep an eye out on, that money is there, and just knowing that. And so to go next into sort of the recommendations that are relevant from the Medicaid redesign team. So their first one is the big one, which is renegotiating or redefining the global cap. A lot of people have been calling for this for a few years because they feel like we don't have, it kind of caps it a little too low based on the metric. And so it would modify how it's calculated or just use a different allowable growth metric, which would increase it so we wouldn't be at this deficit and then we would likely not have to cut programs. So that's kind of the idea there. But it is interesting to keep in mind that if that were to happen, there is going to need to be more money allocated to Medicaid. So it would have to come somewhere else from the budget if that were to happen. But so, like I said before, a lot of these programs are designed to invest in preventative care and decrease emergency care uses. And so it is actually going to sound like there is money going in, even though it's meant to be savings, but it is supposed to do it in the long term, which I thought was really interesting. And so one of the major places that they want to make the healthcare more efficient is children's behavioral health services. They want to incorporate preventative behavioral health services into pediatrics. And they also specified that children's health homes and behavioral health services, which are synonymous with mental health services, are exempt from any cuts if they do make cuts to Medicaid. And then they also want to optimize care for higher risk adults with mental illness, as well as removing technical barriers to them accessing health homes or community-based services, as well as just providing them with more options because there's not that many options under Medicaid right now for adults with severe mental illnesses. And then the last two are, they are putting money into addressing barriers to opioid care, as well as money into promoting maternal health and reducing maternal mortality with a particular emphasis on postpartum depression, which would be interesting as well for our providers that work in that field. And then lastly, I just want to touch on like, what does this really mean in terms of like future directions and kind of keeping an eye out as this budget does start to come out. So current projections with the deficits include a 17% decline in Medicaid enrollment. And during the meeting with the division of the budget, they kind of said that this is an area of particular concern because New York State is not rebounding in unemployment rates as the rest of the country is. We're a little behind. And New York City currently has an unemployment rate that's double the national average. So if Medicaid enrollment doesn't decline, we are going to be incurring even higher costs. So that deficit would be even higher than it's stated at right now. And similar to what Evelyn said as well, but also the Kaiser Family Foundation has done some research on this, and they're saying that they don't anticipate us reaching pre-pandemic unemployment levels till around 2024. So this enrollment really might not decrease. And in that case, we would be at even more of a deficit and more negative impacts than I already kind of touched on. And then lastly, just to touch on Governor Hochul and kind of what she has touched on with Medicaid and healthcare. So she's kind of hasn't taken a strong stance on anything, but during some of her interviews, she did say that one of her top priorities is going to be lowering prescription drug prices. And she did say that there is a lot of legislation right now on a federal level. So she's kind of going to wait to see how that would impact New York State. But she said that even if it didn't get passed, she is passionate about lowering these prices, and even stated that she would think about getting insulin from Canada if we couldn't get it at a lower price in the US. And her goals, she was kind of just giving some numbers, not completely sure on them yet, but around $35 a month for insulin would be the cap. $2,000 a year would be how much seniors could spend on drugs and other prescription penalties. And she wants to impose a tax penalty on companies that raise their drug prices faster than the rate of inflation. So it would basically de-incentivize them from just raising them with nothing else. And then the last one is that she talked about expanding Medicaid to undocumented New Yorkers. She wouldn't actually commit to that, but she did say that she wanted a clearer price tag on it, but she does have a work group working on that. So that would be particularly important if that does happen for social workers who are working with these populations. So yeah, I think that's about all I have. So Tamara, if you want to go into yours.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was really great. And I'm seeing the time, so I'm gonna summarize mine's a little bit more, but it's okay. I feel like the nuance can still be communicated. So what I'm gonna talk a little bit about is school aid. This is a very large portion of the budget. It actually is subject to a similar cap that Sarah just discussed. But that hasn't been happening because actually with school aid, they've been getting more funding than they typically do. So there is kind of just like a brighter light in comparison a little bit when it comes to school aid. So the biggest takeaway from that is that, yes, the schools are going to get a huge influx of money that they typically don't get. So right now, the total amount allocated for schools is $29.5 billion. This is an increase from last year of $3 billion. The biggest contribution is foundation aid. And then in addition, schools also are going to get $13 billion from federal. So I'm going to just break that down quickly. Foundation aid, it's a newer aspect to the budget. The formula was created in around 2011, and it was really set up to address educational inequities between districts. The way that it played out, the state did not fund it the way that it was written out in the legislation, and Governor Hochul actually went through and settled this issue that the state has kind of been going back and forth with. So because of that, now she has guaranteed that the state will pay back what they owe the school districts and continue to fund it. So I'm going to throw out some numbers, but again, this year they're going to get $19 billion from foundation aid. By 2023, it'll be $21 billion, and 2024, it's going to be $23.2 billion. The districts do have to come up with a plan for how they're going to spend the money, and this money is specific to address increase graduation rates, eliminating achievement gaps, reducing class sizes, providing support for students who are not meeting or at risk of not meeting state learning standards and core academic subjects. It's supposed to also address student social emotional health and provide adequate resources to English language learners, students with disabilities, and students experiencing homelessness. So there is a lot of great initiatives that are within there that money is specifically supposed to go to. So that's a huge, huge part. And we are going to be looking at how schools will spend that money. It'll be different from all the districts. And then the other part that I will touch on very quickly is the federal acts. We hear the names of these acts kind of go around all the time. Evelyn has mentioned some, Sarah's mentioned some. So basically, as I said, the school's going to get $13 billion from these federal acts. The money actually is expected to be funding throughout 2023. So just as Sarah has mentioned, the recovery from the pandemic is expected to be extended out a few years. We don't expect to solve it by next year either, and they've made that very clear. Another just aspect they've had with this funding, the federal funding the schools are going to get, is that they are expected to put 20%, that they're required to put 20% of it aside and to save it so they can continue to use it. But then also that money that they get from the federal government is supposed to be specific to helping safely reopen and provide in-person instruction and address learning losses and to respond to students' academic, social, and emotional needs. As you can hear, there's a little bit of overlap of some of that. So we are going to be looking at what the schools come up with to address many of the issues in education that people are seeing in their districts. As of right now, as the schools are looking at how they're going to do that, the two things that they want to keep in mind is that they are concerned about a fiscal cliff, that though they are expected to use the money for several years, they don't want to create programs that are not sustainable beyond when this money will come in. So that is a really big part of how they're going to just spend the money and how they're going about addressing it. So I'm going to leave it there because, as I said, those are pretty much the takeaways.
I just want to add something very quickly to that. Something that was, we think was politically done in that, and this has to do maybe between Trump and Cuomo, but when these monies were identified in the relief bill, they made an indicator that the monies go directly to the counties or districts, school districts, and that they don't go through the New York State Department of Education, which is usually the process that when federal monies come in, they get assigned to, they go through the governor's office to the state agencies, and then it's through that arm that the monies is determined how the money is going to be distributed, and oversight and all of that. So this bypass is also an interesting factor because we want to know who's going to be watching, how the money's going to be spent, and is it being spent appropriately? And, that's a lot of money, and people can have different decisions about what they might think will be effective. So, we haven't heard anything yet on it, but I'm sure at some point somebody
within the New York State budget, these are the two funds that money is funneled to those districts. So if you see any of those two lines, that's that money that you're talking about, and that you said it goes right to them, and they were told what they were expected to do with it. So yes. The budget is always so much information. We could probably spend another hour sifting through little pieces of it. But if you have any questions, even if you have a question about the budget that we maybe didn't address, you can definitely go for it. What I will do, even while you're thinking, I'm going to just put our website and our email in the chat. So in the future, if you think about a question, you could also reach out that way. Okay, so I did put that in the chat. I hope that you will join us on January 17th. That will be our next webinar. We will be going through and analyzing the governor's State of the State address. This is a very exciting time because this is the first time we will watch the governor go through this process. And we will be going through and analyzing that as a preparation for our Capital Action Day, which is February 15th, 2022 here in Albany. So I thank you for joining us. Do you have any, I just want to double check again. Do you have any questions or anything you want to ask? Or are you good?
No, I don't have any questions. I thought that was all very thorough, and appreciate all the information and learning about how, one sort of scratches the back of another and washes the hand of another, and it's important to know this so that we know, so we can be more informed when we are advocating for our clients.
Absolutely. It is a big mission of the chapter that we earn everybody's membership. So some of this work that we do, these are the things that we do. As Evelyn said, some of the documents are 100 pages, but some of these budgets are 400 pages. And it does take time and a team to go through it, but we're glad to. We're glad to. So yes. So I hope you join us again soon, and thank you. Have a nice night.
Good night, everybody.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night.